Last time we just dipped our toe in the waters of deontology. The big takeaway is that deontology kind of flips consequentialism on its head. We're not going to be looking at the actual or expected consequences of some action or motive. Instead, it's something about the act itself. It's its inherent features that it has, and that's what's going to determine its moral status. So we need to start trying to unpack what that idea is. So let's get started. So a little bit about Immanuel Kant. He is hands down, I think, like just sort of widely considered to be the most influential philosopher of the modern era. Modern in philosophy just means like everything like since Descartes. So like everything since like the 1600s. I know that doesn't really mean modern, but like think about that time span, right? Like that's a huge period of time over which to be influential. If you remember David Hume, he was the guy who we looked at in Module 3, who was sort of arguing maybe for moral subjectivism, maybe for an early kind of like emotivism or non-cognitivism. Kant was, 12, 13 years younger than David Hume and was really heavily influenced by him in the sense that like Kant really wanted to refute Hume. And one thing about Kant that you will come to discover in this module, he is tricky. He is really, really hard to read. You'll be like reading and you're like, oh my gosh, this like paragraph is really long. And then you're like, oh my gosh, this is like one sentence. What is going on? Immanuel, like, geez. It can be a little bit intense. It can be a little bit intimidating. So that's why we do the reading quizzes, though, right? They're meant to guide you through those readings. And also, these lecture videos will help you see sort of what's going on there. But speaking of David Hume versus Immanuel Kant, you might remember this is one of Hume's arguments that we talked about that is sort of arguing against the objectivity of moral truths or moral statements. And this is what we call Hume's fork, right? This idea that objective truths only come in two flavors, right? Either through like pure reason or through some kind of like experience. And since moral truths aren't derived from reason, and since they aren't derived from experience, they can't be objective truths. We have actually already seen a refutation of premise 3 here. Consequentialism says, actually, we can figure out the moral status of an action through experience, right? We can figure out what kind of impact it has or is likely to have on the people that it would affect, right? And if it's a positive one, if it brings about stuff that we care about, stuff that has value, then it'll be morally permissible or maybe even morally obligatory. Kant, on the other hand, is going to push back here on premise 2. We can, in fact, use reason alone to figure out moral truths. This is a very, very cool idea. And even if you don't end up liking deontology, it's totally fine, but like, gosh, it's such a cool theory. It's such a beautiful idea. One thing that's going to separate Kant from Hume that we'll kind of need to keep in the back of our mind here. For David Hume, what he calls the passions, those sort of like desire states, they are not like more or less rational or choice-worthy or anything like that. It's just sort of whatever you end up doing, that's the passion that was sort of like stronger in you. That's the basic idea, at least. For Kant, these passion states that he calls inclinations, these can be sort of chosen, sort of acted upon. And reason is kind of the faculty that lets us choose how to act on an inclination and like how to get the things that we want. And so there is going to be this tie between rationality and inclination that Hume doesn't have. So it's a very different theory of action. So right off the bat, we've got some pretty fundamental disagreement. And so what that's going to mean for Kant is that whenever we act, at least whenever we act like freely and whenever we act deliberately, what we do is we are acting on some kind of maxim. So a maxim is just your policy for action. What are you doing and why are you doing it? And it generally involves inclination and reason, right? The desire that you have for whatever it is that you want and how you're going to get it. And so it's generally going to have this kind of structure. So in situation S, so in this situation, I'm going to do action A in order to bring about event E, right? If I'm hungry, I'm going to eat in order to not feel hungry anymore. Something like that. Everything that you deliberately, intentionally do is going to have a maxim in the background. What is your policy for action? And it's these maxims that we're going to end up evaluating. So maxims can be moral, they can be immoral, they can be sort of morally neutral. So here's a kind of a situation. You need money for whatever, for rent or whatever. Nobody's going to let you borrow money. They don't let you, they don't give away money for free. And so you're like, okay, well, I'm going to go rob a bank then, right? Banks have money. That seems to be a good place to get money. So here we have your inclination, which is going to be your desire for money, for wealth in this case, and then your reason, right? Banks have got it. Maybe this bank on Main Street over here doesn't have an armed guard, so I'm going to rob that one. So when I need money, or in this particular situation, because I need money to pay rent, I'm going to rob this bank, since it doesn't have any armed guards, in order to be able to pay my rent. There's my maxim. Here it is as a generalized sort of form. Steal stuff in order to get something that you want. This is a generalized form of that maxim. This is going to become really, really important. So being able to take a maxim in a particular situation and give it this generalized form, this is going to be a really, really important concept as we work through this. Now again, you can sometimes just end up doing the morally correct thing. Let's suppose you've got an ethics exam coming up and you haven't studied for it. And you are thinking about cheating on your ethics exam. How dare you? Well, on the one hand, you might have the inclination to go ahead and try to cheat in order to get a good grade on this exam. But on the other hand, maybe you're like, oh gosh, I really don't want to get caught either, right? That's a competing inclination that you have, a desire to not get caught. That would be pretty bad. And so these two competing inclinations, you are going to end up choosing one, and then your reason will let you figure out how to get that end. But notice, neither one of these maxims, as they, end up becoming, are morally praiseworthy, right? Breaking the rules to, get something that you want, definitely not morally praiseworthy. And as we'll see in just a second, simply complying with the rules just to not get in trouble, you might have done the morally correct thing here, but it's not morally praiseworthy. This is a really, really interesting idea and something that we need to kind of spend some time unpacking. How are we going to explain the difference between these two things? Because if you think about it from a consequentialist point of view, let's say I decide I'm not going to cheat because I don't want to get in trouble. And then compare this to somebody who's I'm not going to cheat because it's just wrong, especially to cheat on my ethics test. Goodness gracious. As far as a consequentialist is concerned, neither student is cheating. The outcome kind of seems to be the same. And so how are we going to make sense of the difference between these two? For deontology, there's a really clean way of doing that through what's called the goodwill. This is a pretty tricky concept. What it is this commitment to do the right thing. To do the right thing because it's the right thing. This is similar to an inclination, but inclinations are things that are kind of like fleeting, right? Sometimes you're hungry, sometimes you're not, right? Some people maybe want to get good at tennis and some people don't, you know? So some people might have an inclination and some people don't. The goodwill is something that we all have. We all have this commitment to do the right thing because it's the right thing. And this is going to be what distinguishes the goodwill from regular old inclinations, and why it's not technically speaking an inclination, because inclinations can all be corrupted. The idea here, and this is what's just called the goodwill thesis, or at least we're going to call it that. The goodwill is the only good without qualification. In other words, any other type of maxim that you might act on, any other kind of like what we might call, you know, an inclination, or any other kind of desire that you might have, it's not going to be good without qualification. So this is a translation of what this means. So the goodwill thesis, the goodwill is the only good without qualification. This commitment to do the right thing for its own sake is the only thing that's valuable. Remember, valuable means good. It's the only thing that's valuable in every situation without any kinds of exceptions. That's what we mean by without qualification. So it's not as if Kant is going to say that like something like pleasure is like not valuable. Obviously, pleasure has value, but you need to qualify it. For example, what if I get pleasure out of like hurting other people? Well, then we need to qualify it. We need to say like, okay, well, I meant non-sadistic pleasure, right? I need to add a qualifier to it. Wealth is another nice example, right? Like, you know, this is something that like, it does seem like having wealth is the kind of thing that'll make our life go well. It does seem to be the kind of thing that's valuable, but we do need to qualify it. So maybe something like, non-excessive wealth, something like that. All of these things can be corrupted because what they are, what their nature is distinct from how they are used, but not the goodwill, right? The goodwill is just defined as this, you know, commitment to do the right thing. And so that's just all it's going to amount to, is doing the right thing. This is going to feel a little bit consequentially, but remember, we're not trying to say that like, hey, the goodwill is good because of the consequences it brings about. No, no, no. The goodwill is good because of its nature, right? It has value because of what it is, and the fact that it contains its use within its own definition. There's no way to corrupt it. I'm not looking at any sort of like outside consequences of this thing. I'm just looking at the nature of the goodwill itself. And this is what allows us to make a distinction between somebody doing something because it's the right thing versus somebody just like doing something because like they don't want to get caught. So this is an example that Kant uses. This shopkeeper example, I've given our shopkeepers names. We've got Alice and Bob. So Alice, what she does, so both of them give their customers the correct change, right? Somebody comes up to the cash register, it's $4.50 or whatever, and they give them, 50 cents back or whatever. So both of them always give their customers the correct change. But Alice does it because she recognizes that she's got a moral duty to her customers to do this. Bob, on the other hand, does it because he realizes like, hey, if I start ripping off my customers and they find out, Like, I'm going to lose a bunch of business. I might even go out of business. So notice, both of them are engaging in morally correct actions. Both of them are giving the correct change. And giving the correct change to your customers is a morally correct thing to do. But Alice, her maxim is the goodwill. She's doing it because it's the right thing to do. Alice's maxim has moral worth. Bob's maxim doesn't. What that means here is not that Bob is doing something wrong. Bob is still acting, as we say, in accordance with duty. He is doing the thing that moral duty would require us to do. He is not doing something immoral. It's just that his morally correct action just kind of lacks moral worth. Whereas Alice, she's doing the morally correct action, and it does have moral worth. In a sense, Alice is more like praiseworthy than Bob is. We wouldn't say like, oh yeah, good job, Bob, like, not ripping off your customers because you don't want to get caught. It's like, no, Alice, you're doing the right thing because it's the right thing. This is the kind of thing that has value. This is the kind of thing that is praiseworthy. And this is the kind of thing that consequentialism sort of has a hard time dealing with. Not an impossible time. And we won't really have time to get into this too much. There are definitely consequentialist responses here, but the deontologist sort of gets this idea for free. And that's a really beautiful feature of this, that we can distinguish between acting just merely in accordance with duty versus acting from duty. Doing something because it's the right thing to do. That does seem to have more moral worth. Now, what that does mean, and you'll find this out in the reading, is that acting out of inclination. So if I do something for my partner because I love them, acting out of love, well, that's an inclination. According to Kant, that lacks moral worth. And that can kind of rub people the wrong way. So that's something to kind of keep in the back of your mind. Definitely something we can talk about in discussions and things like that online. But this is what we mean by acting from duty versus acting in accordance with duty. That's the role that the goodwill plays. And so this, again, is something that consequentialism, it doesn't have, it does have a response to this. There are some interesting things to say. But what's cool is this idea just naturally falls out of consequentialism. So right now, we've got a big chunk of what deontology is about. And it's all about evaluating an agent's maxims. What is your policy for action? And what'll end up happening is when your policy for action is the goodwill, that is when your maxim will have moral worth. Your policy will be praiseworthy in a sense. So what we need to do now is start talking about how we go about identifying morally correct and incorrect actions, right? If the goodwill is this desire to do the right thing, how do we figure out what the right thing is? That's what we're going to talk about next time. I'll see you then.